So I've been asked to talk about bureaucrats in the deep state. And so that's what I'm going to do. I think the first thing to get out of the way is defining the deep state. I think there seems to be a lot of different conceptions of what this is. And so I want to, not that I have a completely clear definition, but I want to make it a little less vague than this. The different ways in which this term has been used. So I'll start off with what I don't mean. And I'll give here the Wikipedia definition, which was probably written by the deep state. It says, a conspiracy theory about a clandestine network of members of the intelligence agencies working in conjunction with high-level financial and industrial entities to exercise power alongside or within the elected U.S. government that might exist. And I guess what I want to do with my definition is feel like you can leave your tinfoil hat at home and point to what we actually can see. So what I do mean are the bureaucrats we see in federal agencies that operate with de facto electoral unaccountability. When we think of democracy working ideally, it would be the case that voters elect politicians. The politicians are supposed to hold the bureaucrats accountable by either firing them, making budgetary decisions. But unfortunately, democracy doesn't work as advertised in this way for various reasons. Voters aren't perfectly informed. Politicians aren't perfectly informed. They often have to rely on information from the bureaucrats themselves, where, the Pentagon might not give that report to Congress about the money they've been wasting. And so there are various failures along the way that keep this electoral accountability process from happening. Even though in a de jure sense, it might be possible for if voters could get together and decide they wanted more bureaucratic accountability, maybe that could work better, but as it's working, or it's not working. Also, don't limit this just to intelligence agencies. Especially include the national security-related organizations, or Secretary of War, if you prefer. And most of my illustrations will be about the so-called military-industrial congressional complex. But I'm not just limiting to them. A lot of this analysis can apply to other regulatory agencies within the executive. And also, and this is related to that first point, agencies whose leaders and policies are not much affected by changes in what party's in power in the White House or Congress. That even if you might have a motivated executive that things such as courts say, no, maybe you can't fire these guys. It might be more costly than you thought. So that's not like a super precise definition of the deep state, but that's what I want to work with here. So again, like I talked about yesterday, this light by which I see everything else, economic calculation, the key to defining bureaucracies. Right? You have management by profit and loss. You have bureaucratic management. I like this quote by Mises in Bureaucracy, in which he talks about one of these agencies frequently associated with the deep state, the FBI. He says, the objectives of public administration cannot be measured in money terms and cannot be checked by accountancy methods. Take a nationwide police system like the FBI. There is no yardstick available that could establish whether the expenses incurred by one of its regional or local branches were not excessive. So this isn't to say that the things that the FBI does aren't valued. They do things like get to the bottom of the Epstein case and things like this. But this value doesn't have any cash value on the market. So that's what Mises is saying here, that they can measure their expenses, but whatever they're doing, it doesn't have this cash value on the market by which it can be compared to their expenses. And so we don't have an objective way of saying they were spending too much here, because we don't know the monetary value according to consumers of what they're producing. And this has many implications. If we could assume the calculation problem away, imagine if we're talking about defense procurement, if we knew exactly what the market value of all the various inputs the Congress and the Pentagon get for the military, they wouldn't want to spend more than what the opportunity cost, or at least everyone would know if they were doing that. Presumably then, maybe, think more about the political economy question. What would voters want? I presume most voters want, no, don't spend more on this than you have to, and don't get more military hardware than is necessary for defense. And therefore, you'd have less room for cronyism. It's I want to maybe measure how definitive I want to say, but I think the lack of economic calculation is a necessary input for cronyism. So if we think of, say Dr. Herbener, he's acquiring his patio. He has plans of exactly what he wants. There's all these specified conditions, and he's open to taking bids for acquiring, or for some contractor to build this patio. Is there room for a contractor to engage in bribery? Well, not really. It's like, yes, perhaps they could go wine and dine Dr. Herbener to convince him that, yes, you should have your patio built by us, but if they don't offer him a comparatively attractive package as the competitors, like, okay, there's this bribe, but if the value of the bribe is less than the difference between their price and their competitors, there's not real value in making a bribe here, right? He knows what he wants. He knows how much he's willing to pay for it. And so there's not the same room to bribe as when you're spending someone else's money on things nobody really knows the value of. So I'd say, yeah, you wouldn't have this room for cronyism without the economic calculation problem. And therefore, the military-industrial congressional complex, as we know it, would not exist without this epistemological limitation. But, of course, the actual state operates with this lack of economic calculation, as well as a number of other problems that I wish to talk about in turn. So these include rent-seeking and rent extraction, the revolving door phenomenon, local politics versus the national interest, incentives within bureaucracies, and we'll round it out by talking a little bit about the role of the media in this. And what I want to emphasize here is that a lot of these things are just a more or less natural outcome of how these structures exist. We don't have to assume nefarious actors that man these congressional posts, these bureaucratic posts, that these things more or less occur. And that, so even if we assume the best of intentions, a lot of these phenomena would exist in any case. So let's talk about rent-seeking and rent extraction. So what I mean by rent-seeking, this is when, essentially a bribery, legalized bribery is a kind of part of it. It's this expenditure of resources to build, maintain, and use beneficial connections with government to curry favor. And this behavior is predictable because, say, if we're talking about defense procurement, the defense firms receive income from government contracts, and there's not a real marketplace here. You have a monopsonistic buyer buying things that are very specific to this industry. There's not really civilian counterparts buying the outputs of these defense firms. And so you don't have a real existing market here. And I'd say the big theme is there's room for fudging. And by fudging, I mean, since we don't really know the market value of these outputs, we don't know how much is too much to pay for them. and there are incentives on both sides to pay as much as possible, as I'll talk about in a minute. And these payments, expenditures in the form of rent-seeking can consist of campaign contributions, contributions to politicians' favored charitable organizations, or various payments in kind. One example of such payments is in kind. A report in 1975 from the Senate investigators found that at least 10 major defense contractors, in addition to the Northrop Corporation, have operated lush entertainment facilities for Pentagon brass. They include quail and pheasant shooting preserves. Right? Don't invite Dick Cheney. Yachts and recreational facilities in exotic warm climates. And so they use these are some of the ways in which they wine and dine politicians to curry these favors, to build these relationships. Rent extraction is kind of the inverse of this, where we think of rent seeking as defense firms coming to Congress or the Pentagon brass and saying, here we are giving these things of value, please pay attention to us when you're making procurement decisions. Rent extraction is the politician, say, going to the defense agency and say, hey, I have these contracts to give out. What do you have for me? Or it might be in a more threatening sense. And this is true of, say, regulatory agencies, where we are considering this regulation that might harm your business. Might you have something for us? So that would be kind of the same process, but the impetus, the demander side, just being the other side. But it's both are expressing this idea of payments made in exchange for favors. And again, this can only exist when we don't know the value of the outputs, not like how Dr. Herbener knows exactly what he's willing to spend on his patio. Next, I want to talk about this revolving door phenomenon. So this is when particular individuals move between a bureaucracy and, say, an industry being regulated and Congress. So in this case, you have individuals who might have been in the military. They end up, after their military career, working for the defense industry, and then maybe they work inside Congress as part of, say, a House subcommittee on defense procurement. That this is a predictable phenomenon based on not even quasi-market. It's a weird situation where you have this lack of, what you want is this expertise, right? If someone's in the military, they might have these better ideas than someone who's just moved from being a lawyer into Congress about what the military needs or wants, or at least, or most importantly, what they're willing to pay for, right? So moving from the military to the defense agency or to Congress, the real value comes from understanding this procurement process, what the Pentagon or Congress is willing to pay for, and showing competency in this regard. So the value of the revolver comes from understanding all these things. But this leads to a number of costs, distortions, and dysfunctions. So even if this revolver, while they're in the military, comes to gain this real technical expertise on what would be useful on the battlefield, this technical expertise is not a substitute for economic value. Right? You can have defense-related outputs that, might be really technologically advanced, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're worth the cost of creating them. So these are really two different things. And secondly, technical expertise itself is probably less important than political expertise. Right? What's going to make you valuable to defense contractors is knowing what members of Congress are, what do they want to contract for? What are they willing to pay for? Do you have this competency in terms of making deals, knowing people? And this will make you more valuable either if you want to move from the defense sector to either the Pentagon or Congress. And both sides have perverse incentives for cost enhancement rather than lowering costs. So this is obvious from the side of the revolver working for the defense agency, where obviously they want to get as big of contracts as possible for their employer. But also from the other side, if you are on the procurement side, on the congressional side, right, you have less of an incentive to engage in cost containment when it's look at the benefits I can provide this defense agency that might hire me after I'm done in Congress, right? There's a mutual back scratching. Right? You don't want to be the one who's tamping down on costs. And again, part of this is because no one can really objectively say you are overpaying for this thing. It's not like Congress is coming to these defense agencies like Dr. Herbener's coming to these patio contractors where it's like, here's exactly what we want. Who can produce it for the lowest price? A lot of these contracts made are for speculative future goods that don't exist yet, proposals. And so in that way, it's very important to have competency on part of the, and again, by competency, I mean being able to close the deal, to be convincing that members of Congress can point to this guy and say, yes, we knew what we were doing, and even if there are cost overruns, we're willing to fudge on that. We're willing to accept deadlines not being met because that increases their future value to defense firms. And the selection process for if you, I don't know, somehow find yourself in this, wanting to be a reformer, you're not going to get very far. The selection process is against cost containment. Your career is not going to go as far if you're going to be that guy, Defense agencies aren't going to want to reward you like they reward the guys who don't engage in such cost reduction. And more oversight can't solve this problem because the overseers are going to be subject to the same incentives, right? If they want to maximize their future value in this industry, they're also not going to not want to be that guy. Okay. Now moving on to this topic of local politics versus the national interest. So what I mean by the national interest here is if we have a certain target for defense-related outputs, all else equal, we want to acquire those at the lowest cost possible, right? That defense based on cost minimization would hopefully take full advantage of the division of labor and specialization, at least on a national basis. Dr. Newman, in his talk on free trade, had mentioned these arguments about national defense exceptions to free trade. So, I mean, regardless of whether certain parts of those production processes are international or if it's all contained within our nation state, we would want it to be the lowest cost possible. If we're operating in the national interest. But what we find for a lot of how this industrial organization develops is that it's probably not fully taking advantage of specialization and economies of scale. So to provide an example of this, so this picture here I have is of a C-17 cargo plane. So back in 2008, the Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, informed Congress that the current planned order of 205 of these cargo jets for the Air Force, that was sufficient for current needs. Members of Congress decided to ignore Gates and further expand the fleet beyond what he said was needed for the Air Force. And why do they do that? Is it because they think he's making a bad entrepreneurial decision in terms of defense? Maybe, but it's also beneficial to employees within their districts. So this C-17, built by Boeing, Boeing says that this program supports 650 suppliers and more than 30,000 jobs across 44 states. And I guess I'm no expert in producing C-17s, but it would seem to me that's a lot of states to spread this production around, right? And this is similar for other airplanes as well. Lockheed Martin's F-35, production of that is spread across 45 states. Is that because this is the most technically efficient way of producing these airplanes? Maybe, but probably not. Why do they do that? It's because more members of Congress will have an interest in not cutting these programs, right? Their local constituents will be interested in keeping these programs running, regardless of whether they are the most whether this is the best allocation of defense-related resources. So we face the issue of concentrated benefits and dispersed costs, which comes up a lot in this realm, where the benefits are concentrated among the people working in this industry. They have a very strong incentive to pay attention to what their members of Congress are doing, perhaps even becoming single-issue voters on this, where the costs are dispersed among all taxpayers, where you as an individual taxpayer, this might be maybe a few tens or hundreds of dollars difference in taxes per year, where if you are the beneficiary of this program, this is your job, this is most of your income, you're definitely going to pay attention. You'll be calling your congressman over this, right? Where most people do not have the incentive to pay attention and lobby. And so this is how you can have local politics overriding the national interest. Okay. Now mention how I like this graph. So bureaucratic incentives. I want to mention, so bureaucrats or bureaucracies themselves and the people making decisions, they're often modeled not as profit maximizers, but as budget maximizers. And I want to say, again, this doesn't have to be for nefarious reasons. If you are a member of a bureaucracy, you probably believe in its mission, right? If you, say you're working for the Humane Society because you care about animals, and maybe you get these taxpayer-funded grants, right? You want to maximize your budget because the more resources you have, the more shelters you can build, the more animals you can get adopted out, the more spaying and neutering you can do, and all these other activities that the Humane Society does. If you don't know what the marginal benefit, you see the benefits here, but without consumers being able to demonstrate that these are more valued than other outputs, you don't know. So again, we have this marginal cost is defined for us, but not this marginal benefit. And so we can understand why, or again, it doesn't have to be a nefarious reason why bureaucrats want to maximize their budgets. They can say, hey, I'm being selfless here. We have this great mission here. The more resources we have, the more good we can do. So it's not necessarily this selfish reason that our budgets are higher, so then, therefore our incomes can be higher. So this is just a natural tendency of bureaucracies. It's not necessarily just this, bad guys doing selfish things. I want to talk about what happens when you let bureaucrats vote. So Mises in Bureaucracy makes there are several good points here about bureaucrats as voters. He says the bureaucrat's pecuniary interest as employee towers above his interest as employer, as he gets much more from the public funds than he contributes to them. So the idea here is the taxpayer being the employer of government employees. So the bureaucrat, both as a taxpayer, he's an employer, but as a bureaucrat, he's an employee. And I guess, regardless, I think of Rothbard talking about government employees paying taxes as an accounting fiction, right? It's not like they produce a surplus from which government can be funded. All right, if so the accounting fiction is, okay, government bureaucrats get this income, they pay income taxes on it. It would not be any different if they were paid their net pay tax-free, right? So that's why Rothbard says this is an accounting fiction. But regardless of whether we say that's an accounting fiction, it's clear that bureaucrats receive more than they pay. And so an implication of this is that the bureaucrat, as a voter, is more eager to get a pay raise than to keep the budget balanced. His main concern is to swell the payroll. So as both this tax consumer as well as this recipient of government services, the bureaucrat is going to tend to vote in what his interests are. And this can become a problem when bureaucrats as a group become a sizable part of the voting population. Mises goes on to say about the bureaucrats, their main concern was to get more out of the public funds. They did not care for ideal issues like liberty, justice, the supremacy of the law, and good government. They asked for more money. That was all. And this is something that politicians can't ignore. And this is why you see a swamp developing, where a concentration of people who don't care about these ideals. They want things to keep growing and will work hard to prevent any upstart from upsetting that. I want to make a minor point about personnel decisions. Acting within let's think about Rothbard and Man, Economy, and State, where he talks about an entrepreneur deciding to hire his never-do-well nephew, where Rothbard says this business owner, in that sense, is not acting as an entrepreneur. He's acting as a consumer. Say if he wants to hire his never-do-well nephew as a favor to his sister, he's engaging in consumption. If his nephew's getting this paycheck that his productivity cannot justify. And so employers acting as business owners in markets, if they engage in discrimination that's unrelated to productivity, they are acting as consumers, and they pay a cost to this. As the residual claimant of the revenue that their firm creates, they're going to be less wealthy than they are otherwise and be at a competitive disadvantage. This is different in bureaucracies. People making personnel decisions within bureaucracies can avoid these costs. They're not residual claimants of the revenue of the bureaucracy. But these costs manifest themselves in different ways depending on what kind of bureaucracy they're operating. If they are responsible for protecting VIPs, one of these ways costs may manifest themselves is VIPs getting shot. If the Federal Aviation Administration is hiring air traffic controllers based on factors other than competence, then more planes might crash. It's not going to be, these costs aren't going to express themselves in profit and loss statements, but in these other ways, and may take some time to manifest themselves. So I wanted to talk a little bit about media and deep state influence over media, where I've become disillusioned of a more naive conception of media. If I were to describe this naive conception, it'd be something like, or especially news media. What do consumers want? I think if you ask them, they'd say, well, I want unbiased news. I want it to be accurate, not fake news, informing me of things that are important. And so entrepreneurs trying to act in their profit-maximizing decision would then be to provide this. And advertisers would want to advertise with this because they'd have the most eyeballs to see their advertisements. But this conception, probably mistaken. It can't explain certain things. So here on the left, I have a picture of The military bowl presented by Northrop Grumman, this big military contractor. I'm like, why would Northrop Grumman sponsor this bowl game? They don't really, I mean, I don't think they have anything to advertise. I don't think they sell any consumer goods. Like, are they trying to create goodwill? It's like, guy watching his football, I mean, like, oh, Northrop Grumman, thank you for providing me with, sponsoring this game. What a great American institution Northrop Grumman is. Now, maybe goodwill is part of it. I think the bigger part of it is that Northrop Grumman is making a payment to a media outlet, and despite, I mean, maybe journalists, maybe some of them have like these ideals that they want to be what people think journalists are, as expressed in fiction, doing this investigative work and speaking truth to power and all this, but you don't want to bite the hand that feeds you. And I think that's part of what's going on here. Maybe it's even clear when today's news is brought to you by Pfizer, right? If Pfizer's a major advertiser for your news outlet, I wouldn't expect to see a lot of investigative journalism of, say, the efficacy or safety of Pfizer's products, right? So, say what might be more valuable to some advertisers, I guess I should just say sponsors, is not so much advertising their goods as controlling a narrative, that might actually be in some cases the most highly valued use of media. And so we see resources being allocated to their most highly valued uses. It could be the case that their willingness to pay to control narrative is greater than consumers, generally speaking, willingness to pay to get the most accurate news possible. Another thing the deep state likes to do is insert their personnel into the media. So this picture right here, this is various talking heads at MSNBC from CIA, FBI, DEA, Department of Justice, U.S. Army. There's quite a few of them. And why do they, well, it's obvious why the deep state agents want to do this. Why do news outlets want to do this? They do still maintain some semblance of authority. They don't want to lose access to the bureaucrats that give them this privileged access to information. And yeah, so they end up putting these talking heads on, and it seems like there is a tendency for some of them to fail upwards, right? People still watch MSNBC after reporting about, here's what these intelligence agents said about Hunter Biden's laptop, right? So it's useful for them to control this narrative, or control the narrative about various things. And also to control various other sources of information, particularly social media. So here on the left, we have ex-CIA agents deciding Facebook's policies. There was a recent Supreme Court case involving various states' attorneys general suing the CDC, other federal agencies, because these federal agencies were contacting social media companies, suggesting to them, like, hey, we don't like these posts going on. So, the CDC alerted platforms about posts related to COVID and vaccine misinformation, like, oh, maybe you should suppress this, it might be dangerous, we don't want that going viral. The FBI communicated with these same platforms regarding election misinformation, right? And I believe the Supreme Court decided that these states' attorneys general didn't have legal grounding to make these or as plaintiffs, they didn't have legal standing. But these are various ways in which even alternative sources of information, the various federal agencies try to control the narrative there as well. Because there's value in it. They wouldn't do it if it weren't valuable to control the narrative. So, to engage in some more self-promotion, suggest if you were interested, there was a recent volume published in honor of Robert Higgs. It was called The Legacy of Robert Higgs, to which I contributed a chapter. Titled the chapter is If Angels Were to Govern Men. And this is in regards to James Madison in Federalist 51, saying if angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. And then it's like, well, let's think more about this. What if angels were to govern men? And basically, the short version is they'd still face the calculation problem. Angels still are not omniscient. So they would have to make decisions over how to allocate resources. And so you'd face a lot of these same problems. Maybe cronyism would be mitigated to an extent, but still there's room for fudging. Angels wouldn't know how much to pay for C-17 cargo jets or how many to acquire. This is still an entrepreneurial issue. And then maybe a more serious problem, conclude that even if angels were available to be elected and to man the bureaucracy, I don't think they would get elected. That is, if we think of the state as this institution for a technology for extracting wealth, transferring wealth to others, that those who most value this ability are going to be the ones that capture it, right? So in an ironic sense, good governance under a state is a public good that will be underprovided, right? You run into the same concentrated benefits, dispersed costs problem that even if most people would very much benefit from good governance, these benefits are dispersed. The concentrated benefits from capturing the state to reward ourselves and our friends, those are more concentrated. We would form a more efficacious political action committee. And so I guess my main takeaway is that these things we see from the deep state, we don't have to assume that these are bad actors. I mean, maybe they are bad actors, but that the incentives and the epistemological problems are what allow this to happen. And this is just what we see is a natural outcome of that, not necessarily just demonic forces or anything like that. So I think with that I'll conclude, and I think we got plenty of time for questions. Thank you. Oh, and also here's some references if you're more interested.